Today, we are tackling one of theology's biggest, most debated, and honestly, most misunderstood topics, Calvinism. So, let's just dive right in.
The word Calvinist itself can be, it can be a pretty provocative label. It gets people really fired up. So that quote from Sean Wright really hits the nail on the head. We're going to approach this as learners. We're just here to understand the system on its own terms, to see how all the pieces are supposed to fit together, and why, for centuries, so many people have found it to be a really compelling framework.
So where do we even begin with a topic this big? Well, think of it like this. Every major theological system has a cornerstone, right? One central idea that everything else is built on. For Calvinism, that absolute, non-negotiable cornerstone is the sovereignty of God.
And this is a really fascinating way to frame it. Proponents would say Calvinism isn't some system that a guy just invented in a library. Instead, they see it as an attempt to consistently follow one massive theme they see from Genesis to Revelation, that God is the supreme king who is in charge of everything, and that he does it all for his own glory. That one idea, God's total and complete control, becomes the lens you have to look through to understand everything else.
Well, this brings us straight to probably the most famous and definitely the most controversial doctrine in the whole system, predestination. And wow, this quote from John Calvin himself it's just unflinchingly direct, isn't it? It says that from before time began, God has already decreed the final, eternal destiny of every single person. In this view, salvation isn't left up to chance or even our choice. It's a settled, sealed part of God's eternal plan.
So, where do they get this idea from? Well, proponents often point right here to a passage in Romans 8 they call the golden chain of salvation. And you can see why. They see this as a completely unbreakable sequence. It's a chain that God starts and God finishes. From his eternal choice to love his people, all the way to their final glory in heaven, every single link is forged by God himself. And the payoff here is huge. It means a believer's assurance isn't based on how well they perform, but on God's unshakable, eternal decision.
Okay, so you're probably already thinking what I'm thinking. The idea that God determines everything. Well, it immediately smacks right into a huge question. Maybe the question people have wrestled with for centuries.
And this is it. This is the first major hurdle where a lot of us get stuck. I mean, if God's plan is the ultimate cause behind every single thing that happens, then in what sense are my choices actually free? And if they aren't truly free, how in the world can I be held responsible for them? It just feels like a complete contradiction.
So to understand the Calvinist answer, we have to understand that there are basically two different operating systems for the idea of free will. The one most of us just assume is true is libertarian free will. That just means for a choice to be free, you had to have the genuine ability to have chosen something else. Simple enough. But Calvinism runs on a different engine called compatibilism. This is the wild idea that determinism and free will are actually compatible. So get this. In this view, you are acting freely as long as you are doing what you yourself want to do, even if what you want to do was ultimately determined by God. And because you are acting on your own desires, you're still morally on the hook for your actions.
There's a classic Bible story that just nails this idea perfectly, the story of Joseph and his brothers. And in this one verse, you see compatibilism in action. You've got two different agents, Joseph's brothers and God, both acting in the very same event. The brothers act freely out of their own jealousy, and they meant it for evil. They are 100% responsible. At the exact same time, God is sovereignly working through their evil choice, and he meant it for good. You see? Two different intentions, one human and evil, one divine and good, wrapped up in the exact same event.
Okay, but if that's true, it opens up an even deeper, more difficult can of worms. If God's sovereign plan actually includes the evil choices that people make, what does that say about God himself?
And it's not just us asking this. As a philosopher William Hasker points out, this is probably the biggest challenge for the entire system. I mean, it's one thing to debate free will in a classroom. It's a whole other thing to try and make sense of real, horrific evil in a world supposedly governed by a good and all-powerful God.
So let's just ask it straight up. If God's decree brings about everything that happens, and that includes sinful acts, doesn't that make him responsible for evil? Does that make God the author of sin?
Okay, the Calvinist answer here hangs on a really important distinction. They argue that God ordaining that a sinful act will happen is not at all the same thing as God committing the sin himself or even approving of it. So think of it this way. God decrees that the event can take place, but the sinful desire, the wicked motive, the moral guilt, that belongs entirely to the person who does it. In this view, God remains perfectly holy, using even the evil choices of people for his own good purposes without ever becoming evil himself.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit, because this brings us to another major point of debate, both inside and outside of Calvinism. It all centers on the cross, and it boils down to a really simple but profound question. Who did Christ actually die for? So there are two main views here. The first, universal atonement, is probably the one you're most familiar with. It's the idea that Christ's death was for every single person, without exception, making salvation possible for anyone who believes. The view inside strict Calvinism, though, is called limited or definite atonement. And here's the key difference. It argues Christ's death didn't just make salvation possible, it actually purchased and secured salvation for a specific group, the elect. The logic is fascinating. They'd ask, if Christ died to save every single person, but not everyone gets saved, then didn't his death kind of fail for some people? So for them, redemption has to be a definite accomplishment, not just a possibility.
Okay, we have waded through some seriously deep theological water, which all leads to a really important question. So what? Why does any of this dense, complicated stuff actually matter in the day-to-day life of a regular person?
Well, proponents argue that far from being cold and fatalistic, this theology actually produces some incredible practical results. First, deep humility, because if your salvation is 100% a gift, there's literally no room to be proud about it. Second, an unshakable assurance. Your security doesn't rest on you. It rests on God's unbreakable promise. And this one might surprise you, but historically, this belief actually fueled intense missionary work. You'd think it would make people sit back, right? But the idea was more like, God already has his team picked out, we just have to go find them. And finally, it leads to a belief in perseverance, that God himself will keep his people going all the way to the end. And that leaves us right back where we started, wrestling with this central tension. Is the idea of an all-determining sovereign God a source of deep, profound comfort? The belief that a wise and good king is in control of absolutely everything, even our pain? Or is it a source of deep concern, raising all kinds of tough questions about our freedom, about fairness, and about the very nature of God himself? That's the question right at the heart of Calvinism.